we'll get started. Thank you again for everyone for joining us today, and welcome to the first Luminate and Billboard webinar covering current insights and trends in the live music space. I'm your moderator for today's discussion. My name is Jamie Lefkowitz from Luminate, and I work with our strategic partners across multiple verticals, including our partners in the live space. I'd like to welcome Eric Frankenberg joining us from New York. Eric's a senior analyst over at Billboard, and he oversees Box Score, which is the touring arm of the Billboard charts, and he handles analysis on global and international charts.
Hey, Jamie. Thanks for having me.
Eric, thanks for joining us. Also like to welcome Jamie Markinet, joining us from Nashville. Jamie is at Luminate. He is our VP of Music Insights and Industry Relations, which that means is Jamie leads our industry trend analysis, which takes shape through such things as our mid-year report, our end-year report, our Takeaway Tuesdays, and webinars like this. Thanks for joining us, Jamie.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm really glad to be here.
Also like to welcome Grant Gregory from Los Angeles. Grant is a research manager on Luminate's Insights team and has really done a lot of the work in the numbers we're going to be going through today. Hey, Grant.
Hey, glad to be here. Excited. Good to do it.
Thanks for joining. A bit of quick housekeeping. We are going to be referencing a few reports during the discussion today, and we will post links to all of them in the chat near the end of the discussion. For everyone who's joining us today, we'll also be following up with an email with those links, as well as with a recording of today's webinar. If you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A module. If we have time, we'll try to get to them, but if not, we promise we will follow up with you after. So let's get started. The live music industry has seen its shares of highs and lows in recent years, record-setting revenues alongside major hurdles for both artists and venues. What's driving these trends, and what do they mean for the future of music? Billboard's year-end touring report detailed record-high global concert grosses and attendance, with revenue among the year's top 100 tours up over 53% from just before the pandemic. On the flip side, we've heard about cancellations of tours and festivals alike for a number of reasons. Not only this, but the way we are experiencing live music is evolving. Innovations like Adele's pop-up stadium and immersive venues, such as the Sphere, are making headlines and transforming our engagement with performances. Today, we'll be covering all of this, as well as industry resilience in the face of economic challenges, new opportunities in the live event space, and insights from Luminate and Billboard's report on streaming and touring. So let's dive right in. Jamie M., coming out of the COVID period, the live event space, and specifically the live music market, has shown some volatility. On the one hand, we hear about these record profits, and on the other hand, we hear challenges that face the mid-tier artists and clubs. Additionally, as we see on the slide, consumer price sensitivity is becoming more of a factor. Are there any interesting insights from Luminate data that you can help make sense of all this?
Well, thanks, Jamie, and hello, everybody. Again, glad to be here. The live space has certainly been volatile when you kind of look at the last few years, ever since 2020. And I feel like through our conversation today, we're going to explore a lot of these topics because we are seeing some data that helps provide the insight into what's going on. You know, our consumer research and audience intelligence helps provide that contextual why to sort of what is going on, especially what we're seeing with ticket sales. And it's been a pretty interesting year so far, especially with some high-profile artists having to cancel tours and some festivals that we heard did not sell out as fast, or had to cancel. I think one of the latest festivals that I heard was also Desert Days in Lake Paris. It was scheduled to be in October, but had to be canceled right at the end of August as well. So there is certainly a lot of volatility in the market.
Grant, you want to do a little deeper dive into the numbers that might be causing some of this volatility for us?
Yeah. So I just want to do a brief timeline of pretty much since 2022. So in 2022, there's kind of a regulatory patchwork in cities that make it difficult to operate on from a supply side perspective. But then from a consumer's perspective, we also had consumers were concerned about COVID. It was a bigger concern than the ticket price at the beginning of the year. And then as 2022 progressed, concerns about COVID fell dramatically, and intent, which is the likely, an expressed intent to attend a festival or a concert in the next year, started to grow and grow and grow. And then it really grew persistently up until about mid 2023, Q2, Q3. And at this point, COVID as a concern had completely evaporated. It dropped, 40 points. But simultaneously, as future intent and attendance kind of peaked in the mid 2023 and is at similarly high levels now, what also was occurring was growth in concerns over ticket price, which then also peaked at 68% in Q3 23, but then it hasn't really fallen much since then. It's a little bit lower than it was there. And then going in 2024, some of the festival things that kind of helps contextualize why some of the festivals have struggled is that over 2023, we saw that future intent for festivals started to drop, especially among core audiences like millennials, Gen Z, and music superfans. So there is a materially lower future intent there. And so I guess the kind of broader narrative that we're trying to paint here is that demand is still high, but so is price sensitivity. And so artists that maybe overestimate their demand via, booking maybe too large of a venue, or artists that price their tickets too high are going to find themselves on the wrong side of that curve, right? That price demand curve. So that's kind of the state of things now. Is demand is still really high, consumer intent is still really high. Festivals are a little bit lower than they were, and yeah, pretty much where we landed.
Thanks, Grant. Eric, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, with regard to price sensitivity, ticket prices among the top 100 tours last year, the average ticket price was up 20% from before the pandemic. And that's not slowing down at all. This year we've continued to see major grosses reported. It's like when you're hot, you're hot. So it's likely that acts at that level will continue to be unaffected by any sort of growing sensitivity, but there's only so much disposable income to go around. And a lot of artists have already had their kind of post-COVID, we're back, we've missed you touring cycle. So there's begins to be this question of when or if or when the middle class kind of gets squeezed out, especially after all of the headlines that we saw, in particular last year, about increased costs on the road and just general difficulty touring in this climate. In theory, dynamic pricing is there to adjust in real time to demand, but it'll also be, of course, up to promoters and artist reps.
And Eric, actually, when you were saying that, especially getting back to the point about the 20% increase since before the pandemic, I was just thinking as you were saying that, I was thinking that is for a consumer in their perspective, that's faster than the rate of inflation that we're seeing too.
Yeah, I mean, in our review last year, we noted that inflation had driven the US dollar up about 34% over the last decade or so. In that same window, top 100 concert grosses rose by 201%. So people are spending money on concerts in unprecedented ways, for sure.
Wow, that is a lot. We heard COVID mentioned a lot, the recession, the economy, so many different factors that are causing these record-breaking numbers and challenges at the same time. But there's a lot more going on than just coming out of COVID and the economy. Given all these dynamic market forces in this space, one thing we see in the consumer research data also is that Gen Z concert expenditures have been growing, and now they're in line with millennials. In fact, they spent the most on concerts in Q2 2024. Jamie, is this the passing of the torch from millennials to Gen Z? And are there some opportunities that you're seeing in this data?
Yeah, so this is actually something we covered in our mid-year music report this year, and it was pretty exciting to see. So for the first time in our quarterly consumer research tracking, Gen Z reported spending the most on overall live events. Millennials were the long-standing #1 spender in this category. But we did see that especially festivals, getting back to what Grant had mentioned too, especially festivals were driving this spend from Gen Z up to take the mantle there. So, I think it will remains to be seen if this is a true passing of the torch and if, Gen Z are going to be the biggest spenders from here on out. But this was the first time in our tracking that they had spent the most, and it'll be really, really interesting to see how this continues to play out in the future.
Grant, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. So there's two things happening here, right? We have a generation that's aging into the 25 to 34 age bracket that tends to have higher disposable income. They're also fully concentrated of the 18 to 24-year-old bracket, which tends to be more festival going. And so what we've seen is kind of a sustained growth in concert intent, expenditure, and past attendance among Gen Z. Well, we've seen kind of since the pandemic, and we've seen kind of a plateauing for millennials. And so we're kind of trying to disaggregate two factors here. One, which is natural demographic transition into a higher disposable income, you know, age group. And then two, there's been kind of a lot of anxiety about Gen Z and maybe not just concerts, but lots of things in the economy. They might want to retreat from kind of physical things and spend time on online spaces. And I think that, we can't say for certain, but I do think that there is some evidence that post-pandemic, they've kind of renewed vigor in this audience. And I think that they're coming out of their shell, so to speak. And whether that's behavioral or not, or demographic, that's a different question. And then what this means for future what we might expect how the landscape to change is that if you look at Gen Z concert goers and compare their genre listening preferences to millennial concert goers, there are some things that'll stay the same, like hip hop, country. Actually, Gen Z concert goers are slightly more inclined to listen to country than Gen Z millennials. But some things that we would expect to grow would be K-pop, which Eric's report noted huge growth. It's like in K-pop revenues, but then there's also electronic and dance. There's a slightly higher listening rate there, and then lastly Afrobeats and Afropop. And we've heard a lot of these genres. There's been a lot of fanfare around them, and it makes sense because that does seem to be where the future is going, or at least where demand might shift a little bit as millennials pass the torch to Gen Z.
Thanks, Grant. Eric, Grant mentioned the year-end analysis that you worked on, and I know this is something you also looked at. So it would be great to hear your perspective on this transition in audience.
Yeah, well, it's kind of two sides of the same coin, I guess. It's interesting to hear about the growth of Gen Z as consumers in the live space, because when we did our analysis last year, we saw that the top 100 artists themselves were younger than they had been in about a decade. And when we zoomed into the top 10 acts, they were younger on average than they had been since 2001, which was like, the height of the teen pop kind of TRL cycle. When we look closer at the top 100 acts from last year, we saw that the artists who were pulling down the average age were also diverse in terms of genre and language and background. The older artists, perhaps obviously, were all classic rock bands. And to what Grant was saying about some of the genres that have been kind of rising over the last few years, the youngest artists were K-pop groups and Latin artists. The average age of the members of Enhypen was 20 last year, and Peso Pluma was 24. There were a few others in that age group. So it seems like the demographic shift is lining up nicely with this, new burst of voices and genres in touring.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah.
So it seems like in addition to the pandemic affecting the space, economic influences on the space, generational shifts on the space, it's becoming more and more difficult to help plan a tour. So I wanted to talk about a study that Luminate and Billboard partnered on earlier this year. As I mentioned, for those who haven't seen it yet, we will be posting a link at the end of the chat, so please check it out. What it does, it discusses the correlation between streaming and touring. And Grant, I'd love to start off with you talking a little bit about the study, its methodology, and its findings.
Yeah. So Box Score has great ticketing data, and we have obviously fantastic streaming and consumption data. And so what we decided to do was partner, where we sampled 50 artists randomly from the top 500. We narrowed the sample parameters so that it was specifically touring musicians. So we weren't looking at people with residencies. We weren't looking at comedians. And once we aligned on that 50 sample of artists, we pulled all of their shows for that year. And then we mapped those shows back to their specific DMA level streaming volumes, which a DMA is effectively just a metropolitan area. So then we were able to map when an artist comes to town, what happens to their streaming. And we compared the week of the show versus the average of the 8-week period prior in the same market, and found a median growth of 42%. So for instance, Morgan Wallen came to Phoenix and his streaming in Phoenix was 2 million prior, and then the week he performed, it was 3 million, right? And we also zoomed it out a little bit and looked at the like kind of quarterly and national consumption, and we did see that streaming volumes did grow the quarter prior to a tour, the touring window, and that's presumably because of marketing expenditures. And then also obviously during the touring window itself, you saw these you know, and Eric will get into this too a little bit, but you see kind of enhanced buzz. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in the market where the growth is. It could be videos of the artist in that market to other people in different markets. And so you see kind of a national effect too. And yeah, that's effectively the finding on the first. There was kind of two components, but we'll get into that.
And Eric, we just kind of talked about how touring can affect consumption. Can you kind of talk about the flip side there? How can consumption affect actual attendance at these events?
Yeah, well, I mean, even more so to what Grant was saying, he was talking about this 42% local streaming increase in any given market the week of a concert. That 42% can really vary, and oftentimes that variance is dependent on genre. So you take country and rap, those are two of the biggest streaming genres in the US. Those artists are often starting with a pretty high base, therefore there's less room to grow. They might be a little bit under that 42. On the flip side, back to K-pop, those artists are seeing pretty enormous immediate growth, but their routing is sometimes concentrated to just like a handful of markets in the country. It's kind of similar to dance and electronic acts. You see LCD Sound System and their annual New York residency. Last year, we saw Pretty Lights doing like 3 or 4 shows in a few different cities. Red Rocks in Colorado in general is a hub for electronic acts. They're also seeing above average growth, especially when they're doing 6 shows in a week, but it's not as widespread across the country as it is for pop and rock artists. Then, as Grant mentioned, we kind of zoomed out, looked long-term national, and really saw that in this post-COVID era, or post-ish COVID era, we're still in the early years of tours interacting with short-form video. So 2 of the first tours that kind of came back in a major way were Coldplay and Bad Bunny in 2022. We saw week after week, each of them had successive streaming surges and debuts on our global charts just from buzz around their shows online. Then the next year there was Taylor Swift and Beyonce. They really harnessed the power of this. So they each had these kind of mini narratives within their shows that allowed viral footage on TikTok of their concerts to turn into chart success and streaming success. Looking at Beyonce's, people were checking throughout the summer, which city is winning the Mute Challenge? That was for the song Energy. Or she had her daughter, Blue Ivy, come out and dance with her on My Power. And it became a thing. People were checking, how is she progressing as a performer? Is her confidence building, whatever? And we saw both of those 2 songs just growing slowly, not so slowly, but slowly throughout the summer. For Taylor, the song Cruel Summer was the opening song of the Eras tour set list. That was a deep cut from 4 years prior, but by the end of the tour, it was a legitimate radio staple. It was #1 for several weeks on the Hot 100. She also had a revolving door of surprise songs that she worked into her set list each night. And fans were tracking, what has she done already? What does that mean as to what she might do tonight or in the next city? And it became a focal point of the show. We saw enormous gains for those songs in the wake of their respective performances, and they kind of aggregated into this season-long boom, at least when she was in the US. It's continued since she's gone overseas. So even when fans didn't buy a ticket or they didn't live in a city where those artists were playing, they could be invested in the tour just by watching and participating kind of online. And, that could last beyond just like one special guest or a one-off moment. And especially when these artists focused on songs that weren't already huge hits in their catalog, their tours kind of, pun intended, turned into like an era of their own.
Eric, I'm really glad you mentioned short form video there and other social media too. It really, that's an important part of, right, kind of spreading the message, allowing fans who aren't there to be able to participate as well, or engage, or find out about it, or share their own expressions, kind of tied to the music too. So really key there, and sort of the dispersion of those thoughts and ideas.
Yeah, and somebody asked a question, and I was gonna follow up on Eric's point earlier. They said, "What do you do with that 42%? What information does that tell us?" And I think the broader point of this analysis was purely just to A, figure out if there is, and B, measure it, had the deep well of engagement that occurs both locally and nationally that on the recorded side you can certainly capitalize on. And so I think it's both a measurement of the engagement that an artist, the buzz that an artist generates when they come to town, and the opportunities like Eric mentioned to kind of build a bigger thing out of an event that crosses boundaries, geographic boundaries, and kind of just builds engagement. And he's right, Taylor and Beyonce's consumption just continued to go up throughout their tour because they were engaging with fans at such a frequent cadence, and capitalizing on that. On the consumption side, actually, I think Beyonce, we calculated 40 million additional streams because of her in-market streaming bumps. So.
Grant, that's a great segue to my next question for you. With all of this market level data, can this help managers, bookers, and buyers, plan better tours?
Yeah. So the flip side of the analysis we did, instead of just how does concerts affect streaming, the flip side is how can success at in ticket sales be explained by an artist's streaming performance in those markets. And so what we did is we took all those 1,000 shows that we had, and we mapped them back to their streaming, what we would call index. So it's the concentration of listenership in that DMA, regardless of the population of the DMA, and then you add population controls. And we found that there is a pretty robust line for lots of artists, and that's the kind of nuance here, is that it varies artist by artist. So in the report, which I would recommend everyone check out, that we wrote, we found like Tedeschi Trucks Band, for instance, has a much steeper slope. So for 1 million streams, every 1 million streams in a market corresponds to about 2,700 tickets for them. For other artists, that slope is a little bit lower, and that may be because Tedeschi Trucks Band is maybe the signal that Tedeschi Trucks Band is more of a live tilting artist relative to their streaming. And the most obvious example of this is Fish. Like, they don't stream very well versus pop acts, but they can sell the sphere out, right? And so these kind of relationships, these slopes, so to speak, can help you A, estimate the venue size that you need to be in a market, and B, kind of figure out how, for another example with Fish, actually, is that they could have done a couple extra days we found in Philadelphia based on that slope and the listenership in Philly. So it is very interesting that we can kind of fit these slopes, but I just want to caution that it's artist specific. Every artist has their own curve, and there's some genre information there too. So, but yeah, again, because older acts especially, for instance, like they don't have maybe active listeners, but there are a lot of fans who they're still lurking in their fans' minds. And if an older artist comes to town, they might not be on the DSPs, they might not be on your Spotify playlist, but and that's where that kind of relationships gets a little bit less like perfectly linear, so to speak. So,
well, thanks for that additional insight, Grant. And we're not going to ask for the definition of the older artist on this webinar. We'll address that at a different time. But I do recommend for everyone to check out that report. It's got some great insights and case studies from artists all the way from Taylor and Beyonce down to jam bands, and it's a really great read. Looks like we're coming up on time, so we're gonna start to close out with one last question where I get to have a little fun and ask the panelists to look into their crystal balls. We've looked at the live event space in terms of the big picture and the headlines through audience intelligence, and we've gotten into the weeds of the consumption data. Based on all these findings, what do you think could be next for the live music space, or some future trends to keep an eye on? Eric, we'll start off with you. We'll go east to west.
Yeah, I'm kind of back to the question of price sensitivity and really where the lines are drawn for fans, I guess. It's interesting as some of the biggest artists in touring are turning their headline shows into like destination events. There was a lot of reporting last year whenever Taylor and or Beyonce were coming into town, fans weren't just paying for a high price ticket. They were spending on flights, lodging, special wardrobe for the show. The list goes on. And maybe it's even more pointed this year when you look at Adele in Munich, or artists having residencies at the Sphere in Las Vegas. You know, the relationship between those shows and festivals, I think, is interesting. At this point, artists have had about 15 years or so on social media where they've been able to really work and cultivate direct relationships with their fans. And it feels as though maybe those relationships are making those artists' headline shows more urgent and more worth the huge cost than a similarly priced festival that has a ton of artists, but maybe the fans only kind of like a bunch of them. You know, on the flip side, we've seen some developing talent, and I don't even know if that's the word for these artists anymore, like Chapel Roan or Sabrina Carpenter. Maybe earlier in the year they couldn't charge those prices on their own, but they've had these unexpectedly enormous festival crowds, and their sets have gone viral, and that's allowed them to build momentum for their own projects and tours. And it's also brought some energy back to those festivals that maybe didn't sell out this year, or maybe sold out, you know, not as fast as they had in years past. So I think that kind of relationship is going to be interesting to look at in the next couple of years.
Yeah, totally, Eric. And I could, speak firsthand. I have some friends who saw that Chapel Roan performance at Lollapalooza, and they thought they were going to catch a quieter, earlier set on opening night, and boy, were they wrong. And to your point about it going viral and sharing it on social media, even from a couple miles away, I felt like I was there at the show with them because they were able to share that experience in near real time.
Yeah, I missed it too, but that again is the power of short form video. I felt like I was there because of TikTok. So it's yeah, there have been a lot of those instances this year.
And Grant, a metrics perspective, what do you think we should be keeping an eye on looking forward?
Yeah, I'm very curious to see how this kind of future intent metric that we have plays out over the next year. Like I said, going into 24, future intent was just as high as it was going into 2023, and that kind of realized itself in the numbers that we see. The 2024 has been a very good year, just like 2023, and I'm kind of curious how long this revenge spending, so to speak, is going to sustain itself. Other sectors, in the economy are also in 2024 seeing similarly high amounts of expenditures versus 2023. And, if 2023 is the best year to be revenge spending as far as things go. So I'm excited to see how that goes. And then number two, just keep a close eye on Gen Z. I think if there's any behavioral changes, if they are starting to get more experiential or indicate a more willingness for, immersive experiences. One thing that we know, especially among Gen Z women, is that there is kind of a desire for community. I think that kind of was taken away from them with the many years of their foundational years. And I think that that's something that's very interesting from a marketing perspective, is how do you build community? And I think that might be a good way to get Gen Z together and out to concerts and to festivals and stuff like that. So.
Thanks, Grant. And Jamie, what does your crystal ball look like?
Yeah, well, I've definitely, even just listening to Eric and Grant continue to kind of think about these and bring some new things up. I know that especially when we're starting to talk about festivals and those sorts of things, and, kind of talking about intent or price sensitivity, all of the things that go into a festival that you're flying to or a hotel. I know that there have not been a ton of details yet, but we do know that it sounds like the Warped Tour is going to come back in some fashion in 2025, and one of the hallmarks of that was that it traveled, right? So it went and met the fans where they are. I wonder, if we're going to see some more things like that. And then I think also, Grant just touched on it a little bit too, but I think that the implications around Gen Z being the biggest spenders on live music in general, because Gen Z does have some particular tastes. How does that change marketing? How does that, what is the sort of the downstream effect of that due to, their more distinctive behaviors that, have been covered in a variety of sectors. So I think that an eye on that and what might come forth from that is pretty interesting as well.
Thanks, Jamie. And thanks for everybody. Appreciate that. Looks like we're coming up on time. To quickly sum up, looks like it's been a wild ride the last couple of years, and it looks like it's going to continue into the foreseeable future. We'd like to thank everybody who attended today. We are at time, so we're not going to have time for Q&A, but as I mentioned at the beginning, anyone who did submit any questions through the chat, we will be following up with you with answers to those. We want to thank our panelists again. Eric and Grant, thank you for that report you wrote earlier this year, which really kicked this all off. And Jamie, for all your insights that you were able to add as well. We really love doing this. And for everyone who's joined, we would love your feedback. If you found it interesting, please let us know. If you didn't find it interesting, please let us know. You know, we'd love to do it again if it was interesting and if it was worth your time. We will be sending out an email with all the links to all the reports that were referenced. They should be in the chat now as well. And thank you again for spending part of your day with us. And we look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks. Bye.